Hey guys, it's Andre from the High Performance Academy. Today we're going to be talking about correction tables. So predominantly I'm going to look at the correction tables available for the fueling in our engine. And for this webinar we're going to be using our 350Z with the dodgy drivers window and our Haltech Platinum Pro plug-in ECU. So we're going to go through some of the options there, and we're also going to look at compensations in a more general sense, and I've got a couple of examples I want to talk through with some other platforms as well. Before we get into that, just a quick catch up with what's been happening in the High Performance Academy lately. I've been behind the 8 ball a bit. My other tuner has had shoulder surgery, so I've been jumping back in the hot seat on the dyno, tuning a bunch of cars, so that's really limited what I've been doing in terms of course stuff, but we've still got a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. Our AFR course is just going through final editing now. Now that should be available sometime next week for a pre-release for our VIP members, and it'll probably be available for the rest of you in public consumption around a week and a half, 2 weeks after that. So we're excited about getting that out there. There's some really good information in there that you just cannot find anywhere else. So we know that's going to be helpful, particularly for those of you just getting started and a little unsure on what AFR targets are safe to shoot for. We're also in the middle of filming and writing our Motec M150 GPA and GPR course, which is a software tutorial on how to use Motec's new M1 ECU. And we've been using that, and if you've been watching our webinars for a while now, you'll have seen us use that in our Project 86 car, which is running the M150 package. We're hoping to have that back up and running fairly shortly so we can get back into some webinars on that. I know there's a lot of you have been crying out for some stuff on turbocharged tuning, and seeing as we've got a turbo kit on that, it's going to be the perfect test bed. We're also a bit of an update on where the 350Z is at. It's still looking pretty forlorn. We have just test fitted our new Racetech 119 seats into it to make sure that those all fit, and basically after this webinar it gets stripped down and gets shipped off to have the cage installed. At the same time we've got the panels to fix up the outside of it, including a bit of a body kit. So hopefully within the next month or two this should actually be looking like a car we can use and drive again, which would be pretty cool. It's handy to have it for the dyno stuff, but ultimately Ben and I want to get out there and use it on the track, which is what it was intended for, so we'll be doing that. Now we've got another webinar. You've noticed we've been doing these pretty regularly now, every fortnight, and the next one we obviously won't be able to use the 350Z because that'll be off getting the cage installed. So we are going to try really hard to bring in a Nissan GDR, R32 GDR, and we're going to try and do a webinar on that using a Link G4 plug-in ECU. One of the unique aspects of the GTR or RB26 GDR engine is the multi-throttle body setup with 2 turbochargers, and that really gives some quite unique requirements for the fuel delivery, and the Link G4 gives a pretty good way of dealing with that. It makes it really easy to tune, and I want to go through that and explain how it's done, because it is quite hard for novice tuners who have never done one of these engines before to get their head around. So let's just show you how simple that is. So hopefully that'll be on the agenda for our next webinar, and obviously we'll keep you guys all up to date with that with an email newsletter. Now as usual at the end of this webinar, and maybe somewhere in the middle, I'll also be stopping to answer any questions. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to bang them into the chat box, and I'll get to those when I can. Right, so let's get into today's webinar anyway, which, as I said, is about compensation tables, and the aim of EFI, and where the biggest advantage I guess comes from with EFI over the traditional carburetor that we fortunately don't see too much anymore, is the ability to give a really consistent and accurate tune that is going to remain consistent across a wide range of operating conditions. Now, that means that as atmospheric temperature and atmospheric pressure changes, that's obviously going to result in fluctuating air density, and what we're really trying to do, with our ECU is trying to do, is match the fuel delivery to the air density, or the amount of massive air entering the engine. So as the temperature and pressure changes, we need to adjust the fuel delivery to maintain a consistent air-fuel ratio. So that's one of the aims of compensation tables, is to keep our tune consistent. Another aspect which we'll look at a little bit later on as well is to also allow the tuner some ability to provide some safety measures if the engine's being driven outside of the parameters we intended for when we actually dyno tuned it. So what we'll do for a start is just go through some of the more standard compensation tables that just about every ECU has, and we'll explain what those are for. So let's just jump straight into our laptop software now, and you can see we've got our Haltech Platinum Pro ECU up and live, and at the moment the engine's not running, so there's not a lot to see. But over here you can see all of the fuel parameters or tables that are available for our fueling, and most of our tuning, this is being run at the moment in VE mode, so most of our tuning is done between this base fuel table, which is our volumetric efficiency fuel table, and we also use our target AFR fuel table as well. And what we're trying to do, as you already be aware, is we're trying to tune the numbers in our base fuel table until the measured lambda value, which you can see down here, matches our target. And when we've done that, that means that the volumetric efficiency of the engine is tuned correctly. Okay, so under steady state conditions, that's all well and good, but as I said, there's a range of reasons where that won't be. The conditions that the engine's operating will change, and maybe our air-fuel ratio will start to drift off a little bit. Now, the Haltech offers us the wideband fuel control system, which we've got down here. We've got our two O2 corrections, which will help compensate for any small changes, but in the perfect world, we'd like that feedback control to have to do very, very little. So let's look at one of the first tables that we have available, which is our air temperature correction table. Now, this is a really key table because it allows the ECU to compensate the fuel delivery based on air temperature. And what you can see here in our table is we've got air temperature on the vertical axis, and we've got our engine load and KPA on the horizontal axis. And you can see here graphically the sort of shape of the table we've got. Now, this is a table that I still see a lot of tuners really struggle to get set up and figure out how it works. And the reality is it is actually a very easy table to tune. The numbers that we need to put in it are not a number we need to guess, because they come straight from the fact that, or the calculation we can do for how air density varies with temperature. And you'll remember that from our EFI fundamentals course, we looked at how to calculate the density of air based on the atmospheric temperature, and what we found was that for every change in temperature of 10 degrees, we see a change of approximately 2.5% in our fueling, and that's approximated here in this table. Now you can see that at 20 degrees, I've got this table filled out with zeros. And the reason for that is 20 degrees is considered standard temperature under standard operating conditions, so at that point we don't need any correction, so that's why we've got zeros in this table. What you can see is as the temperature increases, as it gets hotter, the air temperature gets hotter, what that means is that the air density is reduced, and you can see that for every step we've taken 2.5% out of our fueling. Now you'll see that I have stopped that at 50 degrees at minus 7.5% fuel trim. Theoretically, if we were to continue that trend, we should continue taking 2.5% out. I'd really like to hope that our intake air temperature isn't going to exceed 50 degrees. It's a naturally aspirated engine, so there's really no reason why our air temperature should get too hot. So I've just flatlined that there, just in case we get some erroneous reading from that sensor. It's not going to do anything silly and remove a whole bunch of fuel. 7.5% is as much as we will trim out. On the other side of the coin, we've got where our air temperature drops and starts going into the negatives, starts going colder and finally into the negatives. And you can see we've just got that same trend. We've added 2.5% as we drop every 10 degrees. Now what that will do is, under steady state conditions, if we're say driving down the road at 3000 RPM at half throttle or on the dyno, what that will do is give us very, very accurate control over the air temperature, over the fueling I should say, as that air temperature changes. But there's a few aspects there that make our job a little bit more difficult. We're relying on the input from the air intake temperature sensor, and where that's located in the intake tract can have quite a big influence on what this table's going to want to look like. You can see what I've done here is down at the low load areas. Now this load axis is set up on kPa or manifold pressure, so we'll be down in this area here at idle or during first cranking, when the engine actually first fires into life. This will be the idle and possibly even some of the cruise area that we'll be operating in. And you can see I've reduced some of the control I've got. Instead of at 50 degrees, we should have theoretically minus 7.5% trim. At minus 100 and minus 90 kPa, I've actually reduced that down, so I've only got 2.5% trim. The reason I've done that is what we often see is quite a common occurrence is we start the car, we drive it somewhere, we get it up to normal operating temperature, then we stop, we shut the engine off, we leave it parked up for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we come back and we go and restart the car. Now what's happened in that 10 or 15 minutes is the heat from the engine has heat soaked the engine bay, it's heat soaked the intake air temperature sensor, and what we get is when we first start the car for some period of time, the intake air temperature sensor will be reading a very high temperature, and probably more a higher temperature than what realistically the air charge is that's entering the engine. So if we continued this trend and we pulled out 7.5%, what we'd find is that after a hot restart, often the engine will actually run quite lean. It'll be hesitant, it won't run smoothly. So that's why I reduced the trim down here in the idle and cruise areas. You may find that's not necessary. There's some tweaking to this table depending on where that intake air temperature sensor is and how prone to heat soak it is. Worst possible case for this is an air temperature sensor that's actually fitted inside the inlet manifold. That'll be really prone, it'll suffer really badly from heat soak. So the main area we're actually operating in though under steady state and also under wide open throttle, where we really want to make sure we've got good control of our fueling, is in this sort of area of the map up here, and at that point we've followed that trend that I've discussed. Now one thing before we move on from this table that's important to understand is the numbers we've got in there are designed to give us a consistent air fuel ratio. So let's say for argument's sake we're targeting lambda 0.90. Okay, so if we've got this table tuned correctly and our engine's tuned correctly, if we're at wide open throttle at 20 degrees, we'll be seeing lambda 0.90. And likewise, if we're up at 45 degrees, it'll still be seeing lambda 0.90. Now, maybe that's what we want to achieve. Generally, that's how I'll tune. In some engines, though, if they're very knock prone, we may decide that if the intake air temperature starts to get high, we may actually want to introduce a little bit of extra fuel, and instead of targeting lambda 0.90, we may want to go richer. Maybe we want to target 0.85 above 50 degrees. So we can do that using this table as well. All we do there is apply our change that we want to the table. So if we want to go 5% richer at 50 degrees to give us our richer target air fuel ratio, all we would do is make that change into this table. So say at 50 degrees we would add 5%, so that would take our number in this table to -2.5 instead. And generally we'd probably follow that through as well to the rest of the table. So that's going to have the engine running a stable, consistent air fuel ratio right up to the point where it gets to 50 degrees, and at 50 degrees it'll actually step richer by an additional 5%. And you can basically make use of this table to do just about whatever you want. The important thing is to understand what it's there for. Okay, so that's one table that is really important, but once this is tuned, you really can just forget about it. It should just do its thing in the background, and don't worry about adjusting it any further than that. The other maps that you will constantly be coming into contact with, regardless of the ECU, are the cranking, post-start and cold start enrichment. So we'll just have a little look at these now. In the Haltech we have the cranking injection time, we've got our post-start enrichment, and then we've got our coolant temperature correction. Now I just want to explain first of all, before we can look at setting up particularly the post-start and coolant temperature correction maps, it's important that our main fuel table is tuned correctly first. So we actually have to do the coolant warm-up enrichment mapping after the engine's tuned, and the reason for that is we need to have accurate numbers in our VE table. We need to have the engine accurately mapped first so that the ECU can calculate correctly how much massive air is entering the engine. So we have to do all of that first, and then we can come back and look at our warm-up enrichment. So it's one of the reasons, personally, when I'm tuning a car from scratch, I'll always request that I have the car overnight. So you can do the dyno tuning, the road tuning one day, then you can let it go completely cold overnight, come back and look at the cold start warm-up enrichment side of things. Now, first of all, let's look at the coolant temperature correction table here. And what we've got is a load axis of throttle position on the horizontal axis, and we've got our coolant temperature on the vertical axis. And you can see, so we've got a three-dimensional table there. And we're going to talk about how we can use load in a second. First of all though, what you'll notice is from cold temperature we've got some enrichment numbers down at 0% throttle and 0 degrees. We've got 34% additional enrichment, and you can see that as the engine heats up, unsurprisingly, that tapers off back to 0. Now, one thing I will point out that's really important, and I can't stress this enough, make sure you go through all of your compensation tables before you actually start tuning. And what you're going to be looking for is making sure that there's no stupid corrections in there that are going to have you chasing your tail. And I'll give you a really good example of that in a minute. With the warm-up enrichment or cold start tables, it's important to make sure that you don't have any corrections active in the area that you would expect the engine to run when it's at its normal operating temperature. So by that I mean this engine runs somewhere in the region of about 80 to 90 degrees, and you can see that I've got no fuel enrichment in that area of the table whatsoever. It isn't uncommon though to find some engines, particularly those fitted with no thermostat, that will drop back down into sort of the 60 and 70 degree range. And again, on this map, that's not going to cause too much issue. I've got 1% fuel enrichment here at 60 degrees. But if you had something that looked more like this, for example, where we've got maybe 10% fuel enrichment out to 80 degrees, and then 5% at a higher throttle position setting of 5%. This could actually really give you some trouble, because what's going to happen is generally the engine's going to be operating in this area. And particularly when you're on the dyno, what you can find is you'll run the engine, you'll get it up to sort of 85, 90, 95 degrees, and in that area of the map there's no correction. You come back to idle, your idle mixtures are perfect, and if you leave it there with the fan running, slowly it'll cool back down, and by the time it gets down to 80 degrees, it's actually adding in 10% fuel enrichment. All of a sudden, you've got the engine running much richer than you had expected, and you can't figure out why, and it comes back to this table. So it's really important to make sure that in that area you expect the engine to run, you're not running into any of these cold start warm-up enrichment parameters. Years and years ago, I wasted a lot of time on the dyno, and this is why I'm bringing this up. I had a car, I was using at the time the old Link G3 ECU. They always came with a base warm-up enrichment map that I knew was actually a pretty good starting point. Generally, it didn't need much tweaking, and as I've just explained, it had no enrichment at that sort of 70, 80 degree range. And I wasted some time with this particular car doing exactly what I've just explained. It would run up to operating temperature, I'd run it under load, get a little hotter, everything would be fine, then it would cool back down at idle. All of a sudden my fueling had changed, and for some reason that only Link understood at the time, they'd actually changed the base warm-up enrichment map that these ECUs were shipping with, and now they had enrichment out to 80 and I think 85 degrees engine temperature. So it's a really easy trap to fall into, but it was my own fault for not checking the map. So with the coolant, the warm-up enrichment mapping, coolant temperature correction mapping, the key there is, as I said, you've got to have your engine mapped correctly first, and then what you want to do is start the car and just let it warm up. And as the engine warms up, you can go through each of these cells and adjust the warm-up parameter, warm-up enrichment, until you've got your target air-fuel ratio that you want. And it's reasonably easy to do. What I said before is we've got a load axis on here, a throttle position, and you can see that as you increase the throttle position, the enrichment numbers actually reduce. And one of the reasons we want to do that is at idle, where the throttle's closed, we've got very low airflow. And on a cold engine where the cylinder head, the intake walls, the port walls I should say, and the valves themselves are all cold, what happens is when the injectors inject fuel, it'll tend to actually wet out on the walls of the intake ports and on the back of the valve, and we get a lot of the fuel as being introduced as a liquid, which doesn't burn as well as an atomized fuel. So when we've got very low air velocity, that tends to be quite prevalent. We get a lot of that fuel dropping out of suspension. At wide open throttle, if we're silly enough to start our stone cold engine and go straight to wide open throttle, at that point the airflow or airspeed is quite a lot higher, and what that'll do is it'll tend to still pull a lot of that fuel into the cylinder in an atomized form. The wetting out on the cylinder walls, the intake walls is not quite so prevalent, and that's why we don't need quite so much enrichment at a wide open throttle. So you can map this sensibly. Hopefully not too many people are going to start a stone cold engine and go to wide open throttle, but using the 3D table with that load axis, it's possible to get that correct. But when we cold start or even hot start an engine, we've got two other tables that come into play as well. First of all, we've got our cranking injection time, and then after the engine actually starts, we drop into our post-start enrichment. And those two tables, well, all three really work together: the cranking injection, the post-start, and the coolant temperature correction. Cranking injection, generally it's difficult to give you a firm way of tuning this because you can't use the feedback of a wideband sensor during crank. What we really need to do is tune this table so that we're getting clean and crisp starting of the engine. If we go either too rich or too lean on this table, we're going to have the engine not start crisply and quickly. It'll crank excessively, and particularly if you go too rich, it can end up fouling spark plugs. Generally, with most of the aftermarket ECUs, they come with really good starting points for these tables, so they don't actually need too much work. Post-start enrichment is another table that the engine moves into once it's started, and obviously because this is, if the engine's cold, you're going to be working in both this map and the coolant temperature correction map at the same time. So let's have a look at this post-start enrichment. Again, we've got a 3D table. This time on our horizontal axis, we've got engine running time, so how long the engine's been running for after it started. And we've got our coolant temperature on our vertical axis. And what you can see is at low temperatures, we've got quite a lot of enrichment. So as I say, that works in conjunction with our warm-up enrichment table. And we want to monitor this when we're starting the engine and make sure that we're getting good control over our air-fuel ratio, and that we don't drop too rich after a startup. And also we don't want it to run too lean. Generally after a start, the engine will need a little bit more fuel, and that's what we can do with this table. You can see once we get out to about 30 seconds of runtime, we've dropped that value back to 5% and then 0, so it tapers off. So one aspect of this table is for cold start enrichment. The other aspect though is to help stabilize the engine running after a hot restart, which is quite critical. Now, we just talked a little bit about heat soak and how that affects the engine. What happens is when the engine is run to a hot operating temperature and it's shut off, when we restart it, we'll find that everything's heat soaked in the engine bay. The fuel rails, a lot of the fuel will tend to vaporize with the higher temperature, and as soon as we restart the engine, we actually need to supply more fuel to control the air-fuel ratio. And you'll quite often see that, I'll actually start this now, we will probably see that the air-fuel ratio, actually, what I probably should have done is plugged in the map sensor line for our ECU, which explains why the engine was running so filthy rich and why it was running so poorly. It doesn't really matter, I don't need it for the demonstration. What we will find though is that immediately after a hot restart, the air-fuel ratio, if we don't have this table filled in, the air-fuel ratio will be quite lean, and particularly at idle, that's going to make the engine hesitant and not run particularly well. The idle speed may be erratic and it may hunt, so we can use this table to fill that in and just get everything operating nicely. Okay, so that covers probably some of the main tables that you're going to want to tune. Now, I mentioned another aspect of this is going through your ECU before you actually start tuning and making sure that you don't have any really odd corrections there that'll trip you up once you start tuning. And I've given you an example there with that warm-up enrichment. If you've got numbers in that table where you're going to be running the engine at a normal operating temperature, that's going to be a problem. I'll just show you an example that tripped me up. Many years ago, I was tuning a Mitsubishi Evo 8 using a Motec M800 plug-and-play ECU, and it comes provided with a base startup map from Motec, and in reality that map is only meant to get the engine up and running so you can get it to the dyno, and of course that's what we did. We got the thing on the dyno. My own fault, I didn't go through and check all of the compensation tables before we started tuning. I tuned the engine initially and it was running around about 20 psi and everything performed flawlessly, and there were no problems with it. And a little bit later on, we went to a race fuel on that particular engine, and we wanted to increase the boost out to 35 psi. And that's where we started running into some problems. And at 7,000 RPM, the engine was running into what felt like a rev limiter or an ignition misfire. And we wasted a lot of time on this engine with ignition systems, testing everything. And finally, I found the problem by scoping the output from the injectors, and I found that cylinder 2, the injector was basically shutting off at 7,000 RPM. So let's have a quick look at the laptop, and I'll just show you the startup map that Motec had in that ECU. So here we've got our main fuel table, and again, this isn't tuned, this is just as it's supplied. Nothing particularly awe-inspiring or untoward going on there. But if we go through our compensations, and you can see these are all of the compensations that are available in the Motec. We'll actually drop into our individual cylinder trims, and this is the tables. So this is individual cylinder fuel trimming, so you can actually tune each individual cylinder on its own to make sure that they're all running the same. And this is what we'd expect to see, basically a table full of zeros, so there's nothing going on there. So this is for cylinder 1. If we have a look though at cylinder 2, this is what we had. I'll move across on the table so you can see. It was looked like some sort of weird software glitch that came pre-programmed into this table, and you can see in the table what it looks like. We've got a big trim occurring right out at 7,000 RPM, which is where I had the problem. So looking at the load axis at 240 kPa or 230 kPa, which I was at, we were basically sitting at a zero trim, which is why the first time I had the engine on the dyno didn't show up any problems. As soon as we went up in the boost to 35 PSI though, you can see up in this area here we're trimming out 100% basically. It's completely shutting off that injector. So it was a good reminder to me, always make sure you go through the ECU and make sure all of your compensation tables are zero, or at least have sensible values in them before you get started tuning. Okay, so that covers one of the aspects of using compensation tables, which is to keep your tune accurate across a wide range of operating conditions. I said we can also use the trims to the compensation tables for safety, and we're going to look at that. Actually, before I move on, one last aspect, and I've got that set up here on the Haltech, is individual cylinder fuel trimming, which is kind of what we just looked at in the Motec. Now, what we've got on this particular engine is a dual wideband controller, a Haltech dual wideband controller. So we've got one wideband sensor in each bank of the engine. And what we found with this particular engine was, particularly down near closed throttle, we actually had a little bit of a variance from bank to bank. And while it was nothing to worry about, it was no more than a few percent, because we have the ability to trim that, I went through and did that. And what you can see is we've got our injector trim tables for cylinders 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. Obviously we've got a V6 engine here. And what we've done is gone through, and on cylinders 2, 4 and 6, you can see I've got the same trim table here. Down in the 1000 RPM row, we're trimming out 4%, then at 2000 RPM 2%, and then above 2000 RPM the trims are 0. I'm also trimming in 1% of additional fuel at wide open throttle, and what I found that helped me with is get the individual bank lambdas almost completely accurate with those trims there. Wouldn't be a deal breaker if I hadn't done it, but because we've got the ability to do it and the ECU has the capability, there's no reason not to. So that's how fussy you can be if you want to. Okay, so moving on to adding some protection into the engine. Now, we kind of touched on that with the air temperature correction table, in so much as we can add some additional fuel and start targeting a richer AFR if we desire, and the intake air temperature starts to get up higher. Another couple of options we have is to add some protection for the engine under high sustained load. So what I mean there is we can tune the engine on the dyno, and we know that under the conditions on the dyno it's safe, and probably on the road that's also going to be safe, because on the road it's really hard to stay at wide open throttle and give sustained high load driving on the engine for anything more than sort of 5 or 6 seconds, at least if you value your license. However, if you live in a part of the world where you've got autobahns, or you're not speed restricted, or maybe you are racing the car, it is going to be possible to be at wide open throttle for a lot longer. And a couple of things happen when we're at wide open throttle. The sustained high load means that we're going to get heat soak in the combustion chamber. The engine's going to start running hotter, and generally that's going to make the engine more prone to detonation. We could combat that by adding some additional fuel. Now, if we did that all the time in our map, what it's going to maybe do is actually end up using too much fuel, and it's probably also going to be detrimental to engine power if we're running it very rich. So we really only want to run it a little bit richer when we're actually under sustained high load use. So let's look at how we can do that with the Haltech, and there's a couple of options here. First of all, under the fueling tables, we've got our gear correction. So this is pretty easy, really. We've got our gear positions. In this case, we've got it set up with 5, although we could easily add 6 as well for our 6-speed transmission. So let's say, for argument's sake, I'm pretty happy with the tune that I've got in the ECU, but if the engine's being operated in 6th gear, let's say we might want to add 5% additional fuel. Now, the reason I say that is, if we're in 6th gear, there's a pretty good chance we're going pretty quickly. So that to me is going to indicate that the engine is under sustained high load. So then we can just add that 5% trim in there to add a little bit more fuel, run the engine a little bit richer, and help prevent any potential problems that we're going to have there with detonation, etc. So that's one way we can do it, is through the gear compensation table. Another option, I've set up a generic correction table here, and we can do just about whatever we want with these generic correction tables. But in this particular instance, I've got a correction that is relative to the full throttle timer. So if I go to full throttle now on the car, even though it's not running, you'll see that the timer starts, and we can see it moves across this table. So we can use this every time I close the throttle, it resets and goes back to 0. So we can use this full throttle timer as basically an average load indicator. So on the road, under normal use, probably chances are we're not going to be at full throttle for much more than sort of 5 to 10 seconds. So if we get to a situation where we're at wide open throttle for 10 seconds or more, we could do exactly what we did before and add 5 or maybe 8 or maybe 10% additional fuel, and that's going to be perfect for those situations where the car's being thrashed really hard on the autobahn or on the racetrack or wherever it is that we can't control those conditions when we're on the dyno. We can just add a little bit of additional fueling in there, this full throttle timer, to help safeguard the engine. Now, while I'm at it, I just wanted to show you in a couple of different systems how we can do that as well. So let's just have a look first of all at Motec's M1. They do a similar thing with what they call engine load average, and you can see here we've got a bunch of different tables here that are all called engine load average. So what happens is a background calculation going on inside the Motec M1, and it's calculating what percentage of the time the engine is under high load, and that's constantly being updated. So if we are really driving the car hard, we're at full throttle all of the time, that engine load average continually increments and the number gets higher and higher, and we can use that as an input for any of these tables. So there's a few things we can do here. We can first of all set up a different engine speed limit or RPM limit based on that engine load average. So if the engine's being driven too hard, we could actually drop the engine rev limiter down. That's a pretty harsh way of dealing with safety. Probably more subtly what we can do is start trimming some ignition timing out. So if I just full screen this, oops, didn't really want to do that. I know why. What am I going to do now? Function. Okay. So if we full screen the calibrate menu here, we can see here we've got our table of engine load average percentage versus our ignition trim. So what we could do here is maybe above 90% we can trim out -2 degrees, and if we get to 100% we could trim out 4 degrees of ignition timing. So that's going to help trim the ignition timing and move the engine further away from potential detonation. At the same time, we can vary the fueling using our fuel mixture aim table here. Now, what happens in the Motec M1 is the ECU has a number of mixture aim tables, and the ECU will always reference the one that has the richest number in it. So you can see here all of these numbers at the moment are set to 2.0, obviously a ridiculously lean number that we're never going to target. What that means is the ECU will disregard this table, and it's going to use the main target air fuel ratio table. However, if we get to 80% load average, maybe we want to target 0.88 lambda. Let's say we've got a naturally aspirated engine, it's normally tuned to 0.90. So at 90% throttle, 90% load, we've gone under higher load again, so we want to go a little bit richer. We could enter 0.86, and if we ever get to 100%, we could enter 0.82. So what this is going to mean is the ECU is going to completely ignore this table because the numbers are 2.0. Until we get to 80% average load, then the ECU will start referencing this table, and it will aim for a richer air fuel ratio. At the same time, we can also do the same thing if we've got a turbocharged engine. We can adjust our boost based on that engine average load. So there's some cool and really sophisticated safety features that we can operate using the average load function, which is really just a slightly more sophisticated twist on Haltech's full throttle timer. Let's have a quick look as well while we're at it at the Link G4 Plus software. And for the most part, the ECU offers all of the same parameters, such as a warm-up enrichment table, a IAT, and fuel trim table. Now, another thing we can do for safety and to help protect the engine is set up a IAT ignition trim table. So this is a 2D table, as you can see here, and we've got our intake air temperature, and we've got an ignition trim function that we can add. So you can see at 40 degrees centigrade intake air temperature, I've got a trim of -1, so we're removing 1 degree of ignition timing. And you can see as we get hotter and hotter, I've removed at 70 degrees, -5 degrees of ignition trim. So we can use this table to make sure that the engine is not going to become knock sensitive as we move up in intake air temperature. A good way of doing that on the dyno, because it can be hard to test at all of the different intake air temperatures, is particularly on a turbocharged engine, which will tend to run quite hot in the intake air, we can do back-to-back runs, or we can also block off the intercooler with some cardboard, so the intercooler is not actually going to be so effective, and that'll let us test at the higher intake air temperatures and make sure that the engine isn't suffering from knock or detonation, and we can use that table to safeguard that. Another feature that I'll just look at there is we have some trim tables based on engine coolant temperature, gear, and intake air temperature for our wastegate. So if we're running a turbocharged engine, we can trim the boost out of the engine based on higher engine coolant temperature or higher intake air temperature, again just to give us that safety margin. So pretty much what you want to do with that is really up to your imagination, how hard the engine is going to be operated, and how smart the guy who's driving it is going to be. So if you've got a customer, you're tuning a car for a customer, and you really know that the guy is a bit of a loose unit and he's prone for going out and thrashing the hell out of his engine, and you really want to make sure that it's going to be super safe, you can start using all of these functions in your tune to help safeguard that engine once the intake air temperature gets up and the engine coolant temperature gets up, and the engine is likely to be more prone to detonation. Okay, so I think that for the most part that covers what I wanted to talk about there. Just one last thing I wanted to touch on in that, if we jump back to our coolant temperature correction map here in our Haltech. Now, I said to you that the coolant temperature correction map is used predominantly as a warm-up or a cold start enrichment table. If we look at this though, you can see that we've also got some fuel added here in the high load, so full throttle position, above 105 degrees engine coolant temperature. So we can use this to help try and cool the engine if it's getting too hot. Probably 1% and 3% is not going to do too much, but if we added something like 10% fuel, it's going to help try and draw some of that temperature out of the engine, and again it's going to make the engine less prone to detonating at those high temperatures. So you've got these tables really can be used however you see fit to try and achieve what you want out of the engine in terms of providing a consistent tune that's going to run the same day to day, as well as having that in the back of your mind. You can use it to add safety features as well. Okay, so I think we'll have a look now and see if we've got any questions on any of that. We've got a couple there. Okay, so Limbo's asked, why do you not disable all of the compensations for tuning the main fuel and ignition tables? Okay, so particularly let's look at intake air temperature, for example. If we disabled that intake air temperature correction table, we set it all to zeros, and then we went and tuned our main fuel map. As the intake air temperature changes, as we know, the air density will change, and what that's going to mean is that if we're sitting in one particular cell in the ECU and the air temperature is 20 degrees and we sit there and it heat soaks and it gets up to 40 degrees, if we've got no intake air temperature correction mapping active, what's going to happen is our air fuel ratio is going to start drifting richer. So naturally we'd end up compensating for that by taking numbers out of our main VE table. But then when we come back to that colder intake air temperature of 20 degrees, obviously then the engine's going to be running lean. So we really need that intake air temperature compensation active in the background there, so that it's not actually affecting our main fuel tuning, so we can actually do our job properly and get an accurate tune in the main VE table. The ignition timing trims are probably not quite so critical. Really it's a case of trying to tune the engine. Normally I'll tune the engine with the intake air temperature ignition trim set to 0. I'll see how the engine responds and see what sort of natural intake air temperatures I'm actually getting up to on the dyno. It's hard to replicate real world airflow on the dyno, so quite often we'll see intake air temperatures reaching, say, maybe 45 or 50 degrees on the dyno, and when we get the car out on the road or a racetrack, if we log it, we're actually only seeing maybe 30 or 35 degrees. So it's important to be realistic and make sure we're matching the conditions the engine will actually see. But if we tune the engine with the intake air temperature correction for ignition timing all set to 0, and the engine is safe and not knock prone at, let's say, 50 degrees, then we've got the option of leaving that table set to 0 because we don't need it, or we can use it to trim some timing out anyway at that high temperature just to add an extra margin of safety. Chipset said, so Andre, about the long time on wide open throttle on a turbo application, let's say instead of pointing for the golden number of 11.7, you're pointing for 11.3 or 11.5 using the compensation tables. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really, how rich you want to target is going to depend on how much power the engine's making, as well as what sort of fuel you're running, and in sort of every other aspect of just how much safety you really want to build into that engine. But yeah, running for a target of 11.3, even down as low as 11.0 or 10.8 to 1, that's going to only add to safety. And the thing about the safety margin is you're only going to be running the engine into that if it's actually got a problem or it's really being driven exceptionally hard. So under normal conditions, we're not going to run that rich. And remembering, if we run really, really rich, we will start to see the power the engine's making drop off. So keep that in mind as well. Chipset's also said, what about with naturally aspirated engines? So with a naturally aspirated engine, again, the stress, the load on the engine is obviously not as great as a turbocharged engine, so we can be a little bit sort of less critical of targeting a richer air fuel ratio. Generally, I'll be targeting somewhere around about 0.90 lambda, 13.2-ish to 1 AFR. Maybe at wide open throttle at very high intake air temperatures, I may want to trim that mixture richer to maybe 12.5, 12.8 to 1. Really, a lot of it comes down to if the engine is knock prone. If as the intake air temperature starts increasing, the engine becomes knock prone. That's the point where we really might say, okay, hey, well, let's start adding a little bit of fuel to deal with that. Adrian said on the Link ECU, you can also set up 4D or 5D map or a target lambda overlay table with RPM versus speed and add some fuel. Yeah, absolutely. And again, really, that's a great indication. It's a great point you bring up, Adrian. All of these ECUs, pretty much all of the modern crop of aftermarket ECUs, have a huge amount of flexibility in how you want to add these compensation tables. And there's no right or wrong way in how you want to deal with it. You can use a 4D compensation based on gear or based on road speed. You could use it based on a throttle timer. It's up to you how you want to deal with it. One thing I would point out is it's important, particularly for the ignition trims, make sure that you haven't got a lot of additive trims happening in the background. So let's say, for example, we've got an intake air temperature ignition trim, then maybe we've got a 4D ignition trim based on road speed. Maybe we've got an engine coolant temperature ignition trim as well. And what can happen there, particularly if we're not running a huge amount of time out wide open throttle anyway, by the time we take a couple of degrees out based on intake air temperature, another couple of degrees based on engine coolant temperature, and maybe a few more degrees based on road speed, we can find our total ignition timings actually very, very retarded. The engine can start running really poorly, operating quite erratically, potentially misfiring, and if it's turbocharged, the extra heat in the exhaust side of things from that retarded ignition timing can result in problems with boost control as well. So it's just important to understand what all of your trims are doing, how they're interacting together, and make sure that they're not doing anything silly in the background that you're not aware of. Dan said it was on the HPA forums, but it's preferred to set up charge air temperature instead of engine coolant temperature and intake air temperature trim compensations. Yeah, that's a great point, Dan. There's been quite a good thread on charge temperature compensation on the forums, and it's a feature that it's probably still not hugely common on aftermarket ECUs. The thread got started because Link have just released that feature on their G4 Plus and their VIPEC with their new firmware and its charge temperature estimate. A lot of people don't understand how that works. I'll just give a really quick overview of that while we've got a bit of time left. So it comes back to what I was saying about the heat soak effect of the intake air temperature sensor. Now, what we really want to do is we want to understand the charge temperature. That's the important part. The temperature of the inlet charge as it's entering into the cylinder. That's the critical aspect. So really that wants to be measured right down by the intake valve where that air is entering the cylinder. And of course that's not very practical. We can't get a sensor down there, and even if we could, we probably wouldn't want to because it'd be more detrimental than beneficial. So traditionally that intake air temperature or charge temperature has really been sort of based off our intake air temperature sensor. Now the problem with that is that works quite well at very high air speeds. So at wide open throttle, the charge temperature is probably pretty close, pretty accurately replicated by the intake air temperature sensor. However, at very low air speeds, particularly idle light throttle cruise, the air velocity is quite low, and what that's going to mean is that the air charge is going to pick up quite a lot of heat from the cylinder head, from the intake manifold, and from the valve as it travels into the engine. So the actual charge temperature can be quite a bit higher than what's being described by the intake air temperature sensor. Okay, so in that instance we can use this charge temperature estimate, and I'll just see if I can bring that up on, just don't know if I've got anything here. Okay, if we look at the laptop screen here, this is the charge temperature approximation table, and what it is, we've got our load axis and manifold pressure and our engine RPM axis. And what you'll see is we've got numbers between 100 and 0 in this table. And when we are at very low airspeed down here, high manifold vacuum, low engine RPM, you can see the numbers are quite high. We've got 90 and 70. And what the numbers in this table mean is whether the ECU is going to bias the charge temperature estimate off the engine coolant temperature sensor or the intake air temperature sensor. With a number of 100, and you can see we're pretty close here, the charge temperature estimate is going to be biased heavily towards the engine coolant temperature. Now the reason for that is the airspeed's low, so the engine coolant temperature is quite a good way of describing the temperature of the intake manifold and the cylinder head, which is where the air is going to pick up a lot of that temperature from. Conversely, at wide open throttle, high RPM, you can see we've got numbers of 0 in here. What that's going to mean is the table is going to reference predominantly the intake air temperature sensor, is going to ignore the engine coolant temperature sensor. So it's a way of trying to get that charge temperature estimate a lot more accurate and a lot more realistic. It's a system that Link have just instigated. Autronic actually have been using that system for absolutely years, and when you've got a properly tuned charge temperature estimate table on an Autronic, it does an exceptional job of controlling the air-fuel ratio really accurately. Okay, that looks like brings us to a close. One last thing I just want to mention, if you've been to our last webinars, you'll have heard me talk about our VIP membership program. You'll have also got an email just recently about the VIP membership table, membership system, and we only have 4 places left for our VIP members, so there's only 4 more positions left. $999 is a one-off cost, and that is going to get you access to every course we've done now, as well as every course we've got coming up in the future. I think Ben's going to paste a link into the chat box, so if you are interested in jumping on that, they've sold out really quickly, and if you are interested in keeping your finger on the pulse and staying up to date, we've got a huge amount of course material coming up in the next 18 months, and this represents amazing value for money. Looks like I had one last question that popped up there from Wazza, so I'll just answer that before we move on. So does the ECU add all the trims together, i.e. 3 different trims? Yeah, okay, so that's exactly what does happen there, and that's why I'm saying it's important to understand that those trims are all interacting, and make sure that you don't have a huge additive effect that's going to be detrimental to the way the engine's operating. So it does require a little bit of care. Okay, guys, we'll leave it at that. Thank you again for joining us. And as always, if you do have other questions that crop up, please make sure to ask them in the forums and I'll be in there to answer them. Thanks for coming along, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.